The shuttle descended through the pale violet clouds of Elythara with the quiet confidence of a machine that knew it was arriving somewhere important. Daniel Mercer, unfortunately, did not share that confidence. He sat rigidly in his seat, staring at the thin datapad glowing in his hands as if the survival of humanity depended on the next line he read. "Royal Greeting Protocol," he whispered for the 17th time. The datapad politely displayed the same instructions again. Step forward, bow slightly, touch foreheads with the Queen. Daniel rubbed his temples. "Simple," he muttered. "Very simple. No panic, no improvising, no human nonsense." Across from him sat Commander Lisa from the Interspecies Liaison Office, who had spent the entire journey watching him the way a zookeeper watches an animal that might escape its enclosure. "You've practiced the greeting?" she asked. "Yes." "Without adding anything?" Daniel hesitated. "Yes," he said again, though slightly less convincingly. Outside the shuttle window, the capital city slowly appeared. Silver towers curved upward like enormous sculptures, and elegant bridges floated between them. Several small moons drifted lazily across the sky, glowing softly in daylight. Daniel tried to focus on breathing. "Remember," Lisa said, "Elytharans value ceremony. Greetings are extremely important." "Yes, forehead touch, I know. Not handshake, I know. Not hug, I definitely know. Not kiss." Daniel looked up. "Why would I kiss a queen?" Lisa stared at him for a moment. "I'm just making sure." The shuttle landed with a gentle vibration. Moments later, the doors opened, revealing the royal palace. Daniel stepped out and immediately regretted having legs. The palace courtyard stretched before him like something designed by architects who had been given unlimited funding and mild divine inspiration. Crystal columns reflected sunlight into thousands of shimmering colors. Guards in silver armor stood perfectly still along the path. They all had the same striking Elytharan appearance. Tall, graceful, and almost human, except for their long, elegant ears that curved slightly backward. Daniel tried very hard not to stare. Inside the palace, things became worse. Hundreds of Elytharan nobles filled the enormous hall, their clothing flowing like living works of art. At the far end of the chamber stood the royal throne, carved from pale stone that seemed to glow from within, and sitting upon it was Queen Myra. Daniel had been briefed with images, but images were not the same as reality. The queen looked young, composed, and impossibly calm. Her long ears were decorated with delicate golden rings, and a thin crown rested in her dark hair. Her eyes watched him approach. Daniel suddenly became aware that every person in the room was also watching him. "Do not panic," he told himself. He walked forward, counting his steps. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. His brain repeated the instructions like a malfunctioning navigation system. Bow slightly, touch foreheads. Bow slightly, touch foreheads. Easy. He reached the final step before the throne and bowed. So far, perfect. Queen Myra rose gracefully from her seat and stepped toward him. The movement caused a ripple of attention across the entire court. Daniel leaned forward. The queen leaned forward. And somewhere deep inside Daniel's brain, 2 very similar instructions collided violently. Human greeting. Forehead greeting. Human greeting. Forehead. Before he could stop himself, Daniel did what millions of humans instinctively did when leaning close to another person. He kissed her. It lasted less than 1 second, but it was the longest second in the history of diplomacy. Daniel froze. The queen froze. The court froze. The entire palace became so silent that Daniel briefly wondered if the building had lost oxygen. He slowly pulled back. Queen Myra blinked once. Daniel's brain finally caught up with reality. "Oh no. Oh no," he whispered aloud. Several nobles gasped. A guard's spear clattered against the floor somewhere in the hall. Daniel's face turned bright red. "I am so sorry," he blurted out immediately. "That was not, it was not supposed to. I misunderstood the greeting, and my brain—" His explanation collapsed into chaos. I meant the forehead thing, he continued desperately, not the mouth thing. No one moved. Daniel considered the possibility that he had just started an interstellar war. The Queen continued studying him quietly. Daniel kept talking because silence felt even worse. I promise this was a mistake, he said. A very impressive mistake, but still a mistake. A faint whisper spread through the court. Daniel resisted the powerful urge to run out of the palace and hide behind the shuttle. Queen Myra finally spoke. Her voice was calm. You kissed me, she said. Daniel nodded miserably. Yes, Your Majesty. The silence returned. Then somewhere in the back of the court, one elderly noble fainted. No one rushed to help the fainted noble. The reason was simple. Every person in the hall was still staring at Daniel Mercer like he had just detonated a small diplomatic bomb directly in the middle of the royal palace. Daniel considered the possibility that this might actually be the fastest diplomatic career in human history. Unfortunately, it would also be the shortest. He stood in front of the Queen, trying to remember how breathing worked. Your Majesty, he began again carefully, I want to clarify that on Earth this is not how we normally greet alien royalty. A low murmur rolled through the court. Queen Myra tilted her head slightly. Up close, Daniel noticed her eyes were not a single color, but layers of silver and pale blue, like reflections on water. You do not greet your rulers this way? She asked. No, Daniel said quickly. Absolutely not. In fact, if someone tried that with our leaders, security would probably remove them through a wall. Several Elytharan nobles exchanged confused looks. Daniel lifted his hands nervously. This was a misunderstanding, a very unfortunate misunderstanding, the kind that usually happens when someone reads instructions while flying through a meteor storm. Behind him, the human liaison commander quietly whispered, We were not flying through a meteor storm. Daniel ignored her. Queen Myra studied him with quiet patience. Around them, the royal guards stood perfectly still, though Daniel noticed several of them gripping their weapons like people who had been waiting their entire careers for something dramatic to happen. One guard even leaned slightly forward. Daniel raised a finger. I would like to point out that I am unarmed, he said quickly. The guard did not move. Emotionally armed with regret, Daniel added. A few nobles blinked in confusion. The Queen stepped closer. The entire court collectively stopped breathing again. Daniel felt the terrifying sensation of being examined by someone who ruled an entire planet. You made a mistake, Myra said calmly. Yes. You approached without hesitation. Yes. You did not appear proud afterward. Daniel shook his head vigorously. Very much the opposite. The Queen's long ears shifted slightly, a subtle movement Daniel had never seen before. It reminded him of someone trying not to laugh. What did you believe the greeting was? She asked. Forehead contact, Daniel replied immediately, a respectful gesture symbolizing trust. That is correct. Daniel closed his eyes. I almost did that, he said quietly. A whisper moved through the nobles. One elderly advisor leaned toward another and murmured something that sounded suspiciously like, Humans appear dangerously enthusiastic. Daniel continued explaining, partly because he hoped talking would delay his execution. My brain temporarily replaced the instructions with a human greeting, he said, which is very common on Earth. The Queen raised an eyebrow. You greet everyone this way? No, Daniel said quickly. That would cause several social problems. The court murmured again. Daniel rubbed his face. I am deeply aware that this situation is terrible. Yes, said one noble quietly. Daniel nodded. Extremely terrible. Another noble fainted. This time, two attendants rushed forward and carefully carried the unconscious man away. Daniel watched them go. I seem to be causing medical emergencies, he said. The Queen looked amused now, only slightly, but enough that Daniel noticed. And this greeting, she asked, is common among humans? Sometimes, Daniel said, usually between people who know each other very well. Silence fell over the court again. Daniel realized what he had just implied. Oh no, he whispered. A tall advisor stepped forward, clearly struggling to remain calm. Your Majesty, he said carefully, tradition states that such contact with the Queen is reserved for... Myra raised one hand. The advisor immediately stopped speaking. Daniel blinked. He had just witnessed the quiet authority of someone who could silence an entire government with a small gesture. The queen turned her attention back to him. You say this was an error? Yes. You did not intend to claim closeness with the throne. No. You are embarrassed. Daniel looked like a man who wished to dissolve into space dust. Profoundly. The queen watched him for several seconds. Then she did something no one expected. She laughed, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, soft laugh. The sound echoed across the silent court like a shock wave. Daniel stared. Several nobles stared harder. One guard looked personally offended by the concept of humor. Myra's expression returned to calm composure, though a hint of amusement remained in her eyes. Your apology appears sincere, she said. Daniel nearly collapsed from relief. Thank you. But, the queen added gently, you have still introduced a fascinating question to my court. Daniel froze again. What question? He asked cautiously. Myra's gaze remained steady. Why a human would accidentally perform a gesture reserved for the closest companion of the Elytharan queen. The nobles immediately began whispering again. Daniel slowly looked around the room. I feel like I am losing this conversation, he admitted. The queen smiled faintly. Yes, she said. You are. Daniel Mercer had always believed silence was peaceful. Silence meant calm forests, quiet libraries, and occasionally the comforting absence of people asking him to fill out diplomatic paperwork. This silence was different. This silence contained about 300 alien nobles staring at him like he had just reprogrammed reality. Daniel stood in the center of the royal hall, wondering if there was a polite way to request a shuttle back to Earth immediately. Possibly one that left in the next 5 seconds. Queen Myra watched him with composed curiosity. The court, however, looked like a collection of statues that had recently learned the concept of scandal. The tall advisor who had spoken earlier cleared his throat very carefully. Your Majesty, he said, choosing each word as if it might explode, the human's actions carry implications. Daniel slowly raised a hand. I would like to strongly oppose those implications, he said. The advisor ignored him. In a Elytharan tradition, the advisor continued, physical contact of that nature is reserved for a chosen partner of the crown. Daniel sighed. Yes, I have heard this approximately 12 times in the last 30 seconds. A ripple of uncomfortable murmuring spread through the nobles. Daniel lifted both hands. I would like to emphasize again that I did not know this rule. A noble near the front leaned toward another and whispered loudly, humans appear dangerously uninformed. Daniel pointed at him. That is fair. Queen Myra remained calm through the entire exchange, though Daniel was beginning to notice that her long ears moved slightly when something amused her. Right now they were moving, which meant she was either entertained or planning something terrifying. Daniel Mercer, she said. Daniel straightened instinctively. Yes, Your Majesty. You are a cultural liaison for the human coalition. Yes. You studied our language. Yes. You studied our traditions. Yes, Daniel said carefully, though apparently not the very important kissing rule. A few guards shifted uncomfortably. One noble coughed. The queen stepped down from the throne platform and approached him again. The movement caused the entire court to lean forward slightly. Daniel suddenly felt like a laboratory experiment. Myra studied his face. Tell me, she said calmly, when humans make this gesture, what does it mean? Daniel thought about that for a moment. Well, he said, it depends. The queen raised an eyebrow. That sounds complicated. Oh, it is extremely complicated, Daniel said. Humans specialize in complicated emotions. Several Elytharan nobles looked alarmed by this statement. Daniel continued. Sometimes it means affection. Sometimes it means celebration. Sometimes it means someone drank too much fermented fruit juice. The court stared at him. Daniel shrugged. Human culture is very confusing. One noble whispered, This explains much. Queen Myra seemed thoughtful. So the gesture itself is not always sacred. Correct. And it can occur accidentally. Daniel nodded vigorously. Yes, very accidentally. The queen folded her hands behind her back. I see. The tall advisor stepped forward again. clearly unwilling to let the matter settle peacefully. "Your Majesty," he said, "tradition demands clarity. If such an action is allowed to pass without consequence, it may be interpreted as recognition." Daniel blinked. Recognition of what? The advisor looked directly at him. Recognition of a chosen companion. Daniel stared. Then he slowly turned to the Queen. "I would like to formally clarify that I am extremely unprepared to be anyone's chosen companion," he said. Several nobles gasped again. The Queen's expression remained perfectly calm. Daniel rubbed his face. "Also," he added, "I just arrived here today." The advisor frowned. "Tradition does not consider travel schedules." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That seems like a design flaw." A quiet ripple of laughter spread through a few younger nobles before they quickly tried to hide it. The Queen noticed. Her lips curved slightly. "Tradition is important," she said gently. "Yes," Daniel agreed, "but perhaps we can use a smaller tradition." The court looked confused. "What is a smaller tradition?" asked one noble. Daniel gestured vaguely. "Something less dramatic, like paperwork." Silence. Then surprisingly, Queen Myra laughed again. The sound echoed softly through the hall. Daniel blinked. Several nobles looked personally offended by the existence of humor. Myra turned toward the court. "The human has clearly made a sincere mistake," she said calmly. The advisor looked like he wanted to argue, but the Queen continued. "He acted without arrogance, without intention, and with extraordinary embarrassment." Daniel nodded. "Yes, that last one is very accurate." Myra glanced back at him. "In fact," she said thoughtfully, "I find his reaction far more honest than many greetings I have received in this hall." Several nobles suddenly found the floor extremely interesting. The Queen raised her hand again. "The incident will not be punished." A wave of quiet shock spread through the chamber. Daniel exhaled for the first time in several minutes. However, the Queen had not finished speaking. "But," she added calmly, "this misunderstanding has revealed something interesting." Daniel felt nervous again. "What did it reveal?" he asked carefully. Myra looked directly at him. "That our cultures clearly require better understanding." Daniel nodded. "That is extremely true." The Queen's eyes held a quiet spark of curiosity. "Therefore," she continued, "I will personally study human customs." Daniel smiled weakly. "That sounds very educational." "Yes," Myra said. Then she added calmly, "And you will teach me." Daniel blinked. The court collectively gasped again. Daniel slowly pointed at himself. "Me?" The Queen nodded. "Yes." Daniel looked around the massive royal hall. 300 nobles were staring at him again. He sighed. "I feel like I am about to make another mistake," he said. Daniel Mercer had survived meteor storms, a malfunctioning gravity elevator on Mars, and once spent 3 hours trapped in a diplomatic dinner where the main course had been a living jelly creature that politely waved at him while he tried to eat it. Yet nothing in his life had prepared him for the moment he found himself standing alone in the private garden of the Elytharan palace, waiting to teach alien royalty how humans behaved. He stared at the glowing plants surrounding him. The garden looked like something designed by a civilization that had decided nature needed a dramatic upgrade. Tall, crystalline trees hummed softly with stored solar energy. Thin streams of liquid light flowed through the pathways like calm rivers made of stars. Small floating orbs drifted through the air, quietly adjusting the temperature of the environment. Daniel checked the datapad in his hands again. Royal Cultural Exchange Session. One instructor, Daniel Mercer. Student, Queen Myra of Elythara. Daniel sighed. "Somewhere," he muttered, "a human diplomat is screaming into a pillow because of this schedule." A soft voice spoke behind him. "Is that a human relaxation ritual?" Daniel jumped slightly and turned around. Queen Myra stood a few steps away, her expression calm but curious. Without the heavy ceremony of the throne room, she looked surprisingly relaxed. Her royal armor had been replaced with lighter clothing, woven from silver fabric that shimmered faintly under the garden lights. Her long ears moved slightly as she observed him. Daniel straightened. "Your Majesty," she tilted her head. "I believe you are my instructor today." Daniel blinked. "Yes, technically." Myra walked closer. studying the strange, glowing plants. "I have dismissed the court advisors," she said. Daniel looked around. The enormous garden was empty. "Completely dismissed?" he asked carefully. "Yes." Daniel nodded slowly. "That feels safer." The queen sat gracefully on a curved stone bench beside the path. The stone warmed slightly beneath her, reacting to body temperature. Daniel noticed that even the furniture on this planet had advanced technology. He sat across from her. "All right," he said. "First lesson in human culture." Myra folded her hands. "I am prepared." Daniel looked thoughtful. "Step 1. Humans panic." The queen blinked. "Panic?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Frequently." Myra considered this. "Is panic an important part of your society?" Daniel nodded. "Extremely important. It motivates most of our progress." A small smile appeared on the queen's face. "I see." Daniel tapped his datapad. "Human greetings come in many forms," he said. "Handshakes, bows, waves." Myra raised a hand slightly. "You also mentioned the kiss." Daniel nearly dropped the datapad. "Yes," he said quickly, "but that is not usually used in diplomatic situations." The queen looked amused. "That is unfortunate." Daniel blinked. "Unfortunate?" "Yes," she said calmly. "It appears to create very memorable meetings." Daniel rubbed his face. "Memorable is one word for it." Myra leaned slightly forward. "On Earth," she asked, "when two people greet each other this way, are they always partners?" Daniel thought about it. "Not always." The queen's ears moved again. "Explain." Daniel shrugged. "Human relationships are complicated. Sometimes people greet this way because they are close. Sometimes because they are happy to see each other. Sometimes because they misread a situation completely." Myra looked thoughtful. "You misread the situation." Daniel nodded. "Spectacularly." The queen watched him carefully. "You were not trying to impress the court." "No." "You were not attempting to challenge Elytharan tradition." "No." "You simply made a mistake." Daniel smiled weakly. "Yes, a historic mistake." For a moment they sat quietly in the glowing garden. Then Myra asked another question. "When humans feel embarrassed, do they always talk this much?" Daniel looked at her. "Yes." "Why?" "It fills the silence." Myra nodded slowly. "That explains much." Daniel leaned back slightly. "All right," he said. "Let us try a safer greeting." He stood and offered his hand. "This is called a handshake." The queen stood as well and examined his hand like it was an unusual scientific device. "You grasp hands," she said. "Yes." "Why?" Daniel thought about it. "Honestly, we are not entirely sure anymore." Myra took his hand carefully. Their hands met. She shook it once. Daniel nodded. "Perfect. That was very normal." The queen released his hand. "I prefer the other greeting." Daniel groaned quietly. "Of course you do." Myra's eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. Daniel suddenly realized something important. The queen of an alien civilization was enjoying this situation far more than she should, and somehow that made the entire disaster even more dangerous. The next cultural lesson did not happen in the quiet garden. Unfortunately for Daniel Mercer, it happened in front of half the royal court. He discovered this detail the moment he walked into the palace learning chamber and saw at least 40 Elytharan nobles sitting in a curved semicircle like curious students at a very expensive university. Daniel stopped in the doorway. He looked at them. They looked at him. Then he slowly turned toward the queen. "You said this was a private lesson," he said. Queen Myra sat calmly at the center table, a thin datapad glowing beside her. "It is private," she said. Daniel gestured toward the audience. "There are 40 people here." "Yes, that feels less private." One of the nobles spoke up. "We are observers," Daniel pointed at him. "That word worries me." The noble tilted his head. "Why?" "Because observers usually appear when something embarrassing is about to happen." Several nobles exchanged glances. Daniel sighed and walked inside. The chamber itself was beautiful, though in a very Elytharan way that made Daniel slightly nervous. The walls were formed from transparent crystal panels that displayed moving star maps. Small, hovering devices floated quietly in the air, projecting information fields and recording everything. Daniel pointed at one of them. Is that recording this? Myra nodded. Yes. Daniel groaned softly. So the moment I ruined diplomacy is now part of the historical archive. One elderly noble raised a finger. Technically, it is categorized under unexpected cultural events. Daniel blinked. That sounds worse. Myra gestured toward the table. Please begin the lesson. Daniel placed his datapad on the table and looked at the room full of elegant alien observers. He cleared his throat. Today's topic, he said, is human greetings that do not cause international panic. A few nobles leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Daniel tapped the datapad and a holographic image appeared in the air. A simple human waving. This is called a wave, Daniel said. It is very safe. A noble raised a hand immediately. What does it symbolize? Daniel thought about it. Usually it means hello. Sometimes it means goodbye. Occasionally it means, I forgot your name, but I still want to appear friendly. Several nobles began quietly writing notes. Daniel stared at them. You are writing that down? Yes, said one observer. Daniel rubbed his forehead. The queen seemed amused. Demonstrate the gesture, she said. Daniel raised his hand and waved. The motion looked incredibly simple compared to the elegant formal gestures Elytharans normally used. Several nobles attempted to copy it. The results were unusual. One noble waved both arms enthusiastically, like a malfunctioning wind turbine. Another waved with stiff, mechanical precision. A third noble waved once, and then bowed 3 times for safety. Daniel watched this carefully. This may be the most dangerous wave I have ever seen. Myra raised her hand and attempted the gesture herself. Her movement was graceful and controlled. Daniel nodded. That is the most normal one so far. A young noble spoke. When is the kiss used? The entire room froze again. Daniel slowly turned toward the speaker. I was hoping we would not return to that topic. The noble looked curious. But it appears culturally significant. Daniel pointed at the queen. That depends entirely on the situation. Myra leaned slightly forward. What situation would make it appropriate? Daniel took a deep breath. Well, when 2 people trust each other, or care about each other, or have known each other for a long time. The nobles began whispering again. Daniel immediately regretted answering honestly. The queen watched him carefully. You did not know me, she said. No. You did not trust me. I trusted you not to vaporize me immediately. A few nobles chuckled quietly. Myra continued. Yet you performed the gesture. Daniel sighed. Yes. The queen's long ears moved slightly. That suggests your species acts before thinking. Daniel nodded. That is an accurate summary of human history. The room filled with quiet laughter. Even some of the observers seemed relaxed now. Daniel leaned against the table. You know, he said, most human diplomatic missions do not start this way. How do they start? Asked a noble. Usually with paperwork. The noble looked confused. What is paperwork? Daniel stared at him. You are very lucky to not know. Myra stood and slowly walked toward the holographic display. The stars reflected in her silver eyes. Human culture is very unusual, she said. Daniel nodded. That is the polite way to describe it. The queen turned toward him. But it is honest. Daniel blinked. Honest? Yes, she said quietly. Your mistake was honest. The room became silent again. Daniel felt that familiar, awkward tension returning. So he did the only thing he could do. He smiled nervously. Well, he said, next time I will try the wave first. The queen looked thoughtful. Then she raised her hand and waved back at him. The entire court watched in stunned silence. Daniel Mercer had begun to notice a pattern in his life. Every time things seemed calm, the Elytharan court found a new and creative way to make them complicated again. This time it began during what was supposed to be a routine advisory meeting. Daniel had been invited, against his better judgment, to observe the Council of Planetary Ministers. The circular chamber looked like a cathedral built for logic rather than prayer. Floating rings of light projected holographic star systems above the central table, while quiet analytical machines processed trade routes, fleet movements, and planetary resource reports. It was all very impressive. It was also very serious. Daniel tried to remain invisible in the observer's seat. Queen Myra sat at the center of the chamber, calm as always. The ministers spoke one after another, their voices measured and precise. Daniel understood about half of the conversation. The other half involved extremely complicated Elytharan political terminology that sounded suspiciously like polite arguments disguised as philosophy. Then, unfortunately, the conversation shifted. A tall minister with silver markings along his ears stood up. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "before we proceed to the trade agreements with the Orion Corridor, there is a matter of cultural protocol that requires clarification." Daniel immediately felt nervous. Whenever someone in government said the words protocol clarification, disaster usually followed. Queen Myra looked at the minister. "Speak." The minister nodded respectfully. "It concerns the human liaison." Daniel sank slightly into his chair. Ah, of course it did. Several ministers turned their heads toward him. Daniel gave a weak wave. "Hello," he said quietly. The minister continued. "The event during the royal greeting has generated considerable discussion across the noble houses." Daniel sighed. "I was hoping everyone would forget about that." One elderly advisor leaned forward. "That is unlikely. Several poets have already written about it." Daniel stared at him. "Poets?" "Yes. That feels excessive." A few ministers exchanged amused looks. The tall minister continued speaking. "In Elytharan tradition, symbolic gestures involving the queen cannot exist without interpretation." Daniel raised a finger. "I would like to suggest the interpretation, very awkward mistake." Several ministers ignored him professionally. The minister gestured toward the holographic archive floating above the chamber. A small recording appeared in the air. Daniel immediately recognized the scene. "The kiss." Daniel groaned. "You recorded it from 3 different angles?" "Yeah," the minister said calmly. "That feels invasive." The recording ended. Silence filled the chamber. Then the minister spoke again. "According to ancient royal tradition, if such a gesture occurs publicly and the queen does not reject it immediately, it may represent symbolic acceptance." Daniel's brain stopped for a moment. Then he slowly raised his hand again. "I would like to clarify that this conversation is heading somewhere very dangerous." Several ministers murmured quietly. Queen Myra watched the discussion without interruption. Daniel leaned forward in his chair. "With respect," he said, "this tradition seems to assume that everyone involved understood what was happening." "That is correct," the minister said. Daniel pointed at himself. "I absolutely did not." The room remained silent. Another minister spoke. "Human Mercer, your reaction after the gesture was unusual." Daniel blinked. "Unusual how?" "You appeared horrified." Daniel nodded. "That is the correct emotional response when you accidentally kiss a galactic queen." A few ministers tried to hide smiles. The tall minister turned toward the queen. "Your Majesty, the court seeks clarification. Was the gesture rejected or accepted?" Daniel slowly turned toward Myra. The entire chamber waited. For several seconds, the queen said nothing. Then she spoke calmly. "The human made a mistake." Daniel nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, exactly," she continued. "He acted without arrogance, without intention, and without understanding our traditions." The ministers listened carefully. "Therefore," she said, "there was nothing to accept." Daniel exhaled deeply. "That sounds excellent." The ministers exchanged thoughtful looks. But the tall minister was not finished. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the difficulty lies in perception. The nobles witnessed the moment. They also witnessed your response." Daniel frowned slightly. "What response?" The minister looked at him. "You did not punish him." Daniel slowly leaned back. "Oh." The minister nodded. "In a Elytharan culture, forgiveness in such a situation carries meaning." Daniel rubbed his face. "I feel like I am trapped inside a philosophical puzzle." Queen Myra's eyes moved toward him briefly. There was something playful in her expression. Daniel noticed. That made him nervous. Finally, the queen addressed the council. "The interpretation is simple," she said calmly. The ministers leaned forward. "The human embarrassed himself." Daniel nodded again. "Very much. And I chose to forgive him." The room became quiet. The ministers slowly accepted the answer. Daniel leaned back in relief. Then the queen added one more sentence. Besides, she said thoughtfully, he continues to provide excellent cultural lessons. Several ministers turned toward Daniel again. Daniel sighed. I feel like that compliment is somehow dangerous. Months passed on Elythara, though Daniel Mercer often felt as if time there moved according to a completely different set of rules. The palace had grown strangely familiar to him. The glowing corridors, the quiet humming machines, and the endless sky filled with drifting moons no longer made him feel like an accidental visitor in a very advanced museum. He had become something far more unusual, a human who accidentally caused one of the most discussed diplomatic events in Elytharan history. Daniel stood once again in the palace garden where the strange cultural lessons had first begun. The crystalline trees glowed softly in the evening light, and small silver insects drifted lazily through the air, carrying pollen between floating flowers. He had just finished another session explaining Earth customs to a group of Elytharan scholars. Today's topic had been human humor. The scholars had taken it very seriously. Too seriously. Daniel sighed and sat on the familiar stone bench. You know, he muttered to himself, teaching an alien civilization about sarcasm might have been a strategic mistake. Why? The voice behind him had become a very familiar sound. Daniel turned his head. Queen Myra approached along the garden path, her long silver robe flowing softly as she walked. Without the rigid ceremony of the throne room, she seemed less like a distant ruler and more like someone quietly enjoying the strange turn her life had taken. Daniel leaned back. Because, he said, half the royal scholars now believe sarcasm is a sacred human ritual. Myra smiled slightly. That explains several very confusing reports I have received. She sat beside him. For a moment they both watched the floating lanterns drifting above the garden. Life had changed since the day Daniel had accidentally turned a diplomatic greeting into a palace legend. At first the court had watched him like a walking catastrophe. Now they watched him with curiosity, and sometimes amusement. Daniel had become the official cultural liaison for the Elytharan crown. His days were filled with explaining Earth traditions, answering bizarre questions about human behavior, and occasionally preventing the nobles from attempting experimental greetings on visiting ambassadors. He had learned things as well. Elytharans valued honesty more than perfection, and Queen Myra valued something even rarer, genuine moments. The queen broke the silence. The council meeting today was productive. Daniel nodded. I heard. The trade alliance with the Human Coalition has been approved. Daniel smiled. That is excellent news. It seems, she continued, that your presence here has improved relations. Daniel tilted his head. That may be the most polite way anyone has ever described my mistakes. Myra looked at him. You do not see it? See what? The court has grown comfortable with you. Daniel shrugged. That took a while. You forced them to confront something unusual. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What was that? The queen's eyes reflected the soft light of the garden. Imperfection. Daniel thought about that. That sounds philosophical. It is. He laughed quietly. You know, on Earth we usually achieve that lesson through embarrassing stories at family dinners. Myra tilted her head. Humans seem to enjoy embarrassing stories. We do, Daniel admitted. The garden grew quiet again. Finally, the queen spoke once more. When you first arrived, she said, you feared you had ruined diplomacy. Daniel nodded. Yes, I distinctly remember planning my escape route. You considered running away. Briefly, Myra smiled. And now? Daniel looked around the glowing garden. Now I think the galaxy might survive one human mistake. The queen stood and walked a few steps along the path. Daniel followed her. They stopped beneath a tall crystal tree that hummed softly with stored energy from the twin moons above. Myra turned toward him. There is still one cultural question I have not fully understood. Daniel crossed his arms. That sounds dangerous. The queen's expression carried that familiar spark of curiosity. On Earth, she said, when two people greet each other with a kiss, is it always accidental? Daniel stared at her. For several seconds he said nothing. The moment felt strangely similar to that first meeting in the throne hall. Except this time, there was no shocked court. No panicked diplomats, just the quiet garden and the soft light of Elythara's moons. Daniel exhaled slowly. Well, he said, sometimes it happens by accident. And sometimes, he said carefully, people choose it. The queen studied his face. Her long ears shifted slightly. Daniel suddenly realized something. He was no longer the terrified diplomat who had walked into the palace months ago. He had learned the rhythms of this world. He had learned its people. And he had learned that sometimes the most important moments in the galaxy began with mistakes. Myra stepped closer. Daniel did not panic this time. The queen's voice was quiet. Then perhaps, she said softly, we should ensure our next greeting is not a mistake. Daniel smiled. Agreed. Somewhere in the palace, the royal historians were still arguing about the meaning of the first kiss. But beneath the glowing trees of Elythara, the second one needed no explanation.